what I'd like to do is introduce Rosie. Rosie is the Director of Biodiversity and Ecosystem Science at CEH, the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. I'm sure Rosie will tell you what what her research interests are, but Rosie has done seminal research on the trade-offs between provisioning and other ecosystem services from agricultural land. She's worked on the valuation of natural capital and ecosystem services, and she's worked on persistence and transmission of insect pathogens and the risk assessment of genetically modified plants and viruses. Rosie has a lot of different caps on, and I don't know how she managed to do all that, but she is chair of the advisory committee on releases to the environment. She's also vice president and member of the Council for the British Ecological Society. She's the co-founder of the Natural Capital Initiative. She played a very, very important role in the UK National Ecosystem Assessment and member of the first Natural Capital Committee. Very recently, and that's where I convinced Rosie to come and talk to us, Rosie became a member of the NRN Science Board. The NRN Science Board is the key source of independent advice to the Research Council on matters concerning NRN's environmental science portfolio and strategy. So a very important place to be at, very important in that this advice is what essentially guides our research in this area. So Rosie, I'd like to thank you very much for accepting to do this talk, and I'd like to welcome you.
Okay, good evening. Thank you very much for inviting me. I am going to be talking about, rather provocatively I suppose, entitled Natural Capital, because just those words, natural capital, do provoke some controversy in the academic and the policy world. But actually, at the core of this agenda, I think there's a very common agenda that links a lot of activities across DEFRA, Welsh Government and Scottish Government, and across current Research Council interests. During my talk, what I really want to do today is talk a little bit about the research challenges that Natural Capital Agenda presents, and I'm going to try to draw on three strands as I talk about those research challenges. One of those strands is from being a member of the first Natural Capital Committee. I'll tell you a little bit about that, and I'll draw a little bit on the work that we did during those 3.5 years. One strand is what keeps me awake at night as the science director at the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, as we really kind of redesign and repurpose our kind of core activities for the next decade. And the other strand is actually I'm also leading the programme coordination team of the Valuing Nature programme, which is a Research Council investment which involves NRC, DEFRA, BBSRC, ESRC and AHRC. So I'll be talking a little bit about that as well. But of course, first of all, one should define one's terms. So, what is natural capital? Well, actually, you quite often you actually hear the terms natural capital and ecosystems and biodiversity used rather interchangeably, yet actually they are nested rather than equivalent things. Biodiversity as the rich kind of genetic resources and species that we have here on Earth. Ecosystems are really when those species come together and interact. But natural capital is actually more than that. It also actually includes subsoil assets and non-renewables. So it's potentially everything about the natural environment, but it is not everything because it's bounded by utility. It's bounded by the fact that the ultimate purpose of considering natural capital is its utility to human health and well-being. So it's an extension of the kind of ecosystem services concept with a focus on stocks. And I show you a reference there. I think the website might have changed, but hopefully, if you really want to look at that working paper on what is natural capital, putting in that search term, you will be able to find it. Now, there are similar concepts within Welsh Government, although albeit often a slightly different language. And Welsh Government have been have introduced recently quite innovative legislation, which is all about the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, which has 7 wellbeing goals. And in looking at this, it seems very much in line with natural capital thinking. What's the core kind of central theme? I would say it's the links between the environment and human health and well-being. And actually that's also at the core of the research challenges that I want to talk about. Isabel in her introduction kind of alluded to the fact that these concepts have been developing in policy for a while. There was the Millennium Assessment that was published around about 2005, which kind of first really articulated in a global context how the environment contributes to human health and well-being. And then, partly because Bob Watson, who'd been so closely involved in the Millennium Assessment, became DEFRA's chief scientist, we then had a UK-focused national ecosystem assessment, which really elaborated those links in a UK context. And that it came at just the right time. It ended up being hugely influential and continues to be influential in the policy agenda. We had the Natural Environment White Paper, we have had the Land Use Strategy in Scotland, and we've also had the Natural Resources Wales and Welsh Government picking up this agenda, most recently with the Health and the Future Generations Act. So the underlying concept then is not just this hand-wavy, the environment improves our health and well-being. It is actually that it's about the hard evidence that links elements of the environment to aspects of human health and well-being. But again, and also to economic growth and productivity. But the evidence is patchy. In some areas it's very compelling. You can produce really quite a strong argument that will illustrate that actually if we improved our air quality to appropriate standards, we could save the equivalent of somewhere between 9 and 20 billion pounds per annum. But in other areas of this field, the evidence is very gappy. This has been recognised by the research councils, and there have been actually a whole series of research programmes. There's been the Biodiversity and Ecosystem Service Sustainability Programme, BESS. There has been ESPA, which has really looked at these issues in the context of poverty alleviation. And currently there's also the Valuing Nature Programme, which I am involved in coordinating and leading, relatively small compared to BESS and ESPA, but very focused on better understanding the complexities of the natural environment in valuation analyses. And this does have what I think will become an increasingly common lineup of interdisciplinary funders. It's not just NERC, it's also ESRC, Arts and Humanities, BBSRC and DEFRA. Actually, the inclusion of arts and humanities I think will become increasingly frequent, but it's new territory for a lot of people, particularly in the environmental research community, to understand the language of these other disciplines and to work out how to kind of collaborate, co-design projects and collaborate with them effectively. But in setting this programme up, actually NERC did 2 quite important things. Actually, from 2011 to 2013, it funded a pilot phase, which was led by Ian Bateman, an economist, to kind of pump prime the research community on thinking about this area in an interdisciplinary way. And the second thing it did is that even though it's a small programme, it has invested in this coordination team that I'm leading that actually involves parts of a great bunch of people, including Charles Godfrey as the policy champion, Guy Duke as my business champion, and people representing all these different disciplines, so that we can really develop a set of activities to help and develop this research community, as well as work with the projects that actually get funded under this call. So please do visit the Valuing Nature Programme website. Just put in Valuing Nature Programme, you should be able to find it, to see how you can get involved in that network and the sort of events that are going on. The research goal, so I've already talked a little bit about that first goal, which is the network itself. And there are two kind of research themes, one of which is the human health and well-being theme, which is about linking environment to human health and well-being in some specific contexts there. Those proposals have been awarded and those projects are just about to start. And then there's also a tipping points call, which has just closed actually, but I'm going to be talking a little and you know, in terms of new bids, but the decision has yet to be made which of those proposals will be funded, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that tipping points call later in the context of this agenda. So how is this agenda developing in various policy contexts? And I'm afraid that even though the Natural Capital Committee rather bizarrely was focused on England, I'm afraid I am going to be drawing on some of that work that I was involved in. But these frameworks obviously, you know, read across all boundaries. So this is kind of the Natural Capital Committee's framework in its simplest possible incarnation. That the natural environment has a stock of assets, that from those stock of assets, such as water, soil, species, ecosystems, we manage those assets to deliver ecosystem services, you know, such as, for example, we grow food, we grow timber. We then combine those with other capital inputs, which might be machinery or human knowledge, to convert those into goods that we actually value. So I always, you know, find it easier to talk about examples rather than things in the abstract. So because we're in the Water Research Institute, I decided to draw my examples from the asset, the natural capital asset of freshwater. So our UK's freshwater assets include rivers, lakes, ponds, wetlands, and groundwater, and they provide actually a whole range of benefits, not just water supply, but, you know, pure water, flood mitigation, habitat for wildlife and recreation, and so on. So how can we use this framework to understand how to enhance those benefits? Well, in the Natural Capital Committee framework, we actually found that quite frequently we would link the assets to the benefits through a kind of lens of major land use categories. Now, there are pros and cons to doing this. But the thing is that actually a lot of our data is actually collected in terms of these major land use categories. For example, something called Countryside Survey, which was a kind of collaboration between CEH and DEFRA, is the closest thing we've had in the past to an audit of our natural capital, and that was really collecting data as a stratified random sample across the UK in these major land use categories. But there are also cons to doing it this way. You know, if you're really going to assess the delivery of benefits by these broad habitats, there are important issues such as soil, which of course are dispersed across all broad habitats. So there are things that you could potentially miss by doing it this way. But what's actually behind what seems to be you know, a very simple framework really is the need to characterize the relationships between the assets and the benefits. And as a natural asset status deteriorates, the benefits that it delivers may reduce, potentially below critical levels. And it may be that you have a non-linear relationship which goes through a threshold. And when it goes from due to anthropogenic pressures, if you're, let's just imagine this natural asset status is some kind of broad habitat. Through anthropogenic pressures, the quality of that broad habitat may decline, therefore the benefits decrease. This may go below the required level. On the other hand, these relationships may be linear, there may be no dramatic tipping point. And they may be in decline, but actually they still may remain above a required level of a benefit. But actually the tipping points call I mentioned earlier of the Valuing Nature programme is really all about characterising these sorts of relationships. And one particular challenge is to detect when there may be tipping points and you may be approaching a tipping point before you actually go through it. If we go back to our freshwater example, of course, it actually provides a good example of tipping points. We know that tipping points do exist in these sorts of systems where you may get, after nutrient enrichment or some other disturbance, you may suddenly get an algal bloom that has knock-on consequences for all sorts of benefits to be derived from that asset. But a kind of crucial thing is we do need to understand the mechanisms. So we need to understand the drivers of those relationships as well as the kind of form and nature of those relationships if we are going to understand how to manage to restore those assets. So, having sort of set that context, in the next part of my talk, I'd like to move on to what keeps me awake at night as a science director at CEH, and I was just looking at the Wales website and pulled out some text that talks about measuring progress. So I know there's a lot of work and thought going on in Welsh Government about indicators. There's been a lot of work going on in DEFRA about biodiversity indicators in particular. There's a lot of work in Scottish Government about their Natural Capital Asset Index. We actually live in the UK, one of the best monitored countries in the world. But are we actually measuring the right things? The thing is, of course, our monitoring schemes have been developed historically under a different paradigm, a different framework. And, you know, CEH does have a specific role as a UK-based environmental research institute with, you know, a duty to deliver national capability in this context. We also have a pedigree. I've already mentioned Countryside Survey. We have been coordinating the Environmental Change Network as well for the last couple of decades. And they're just two examples of actually a number of different monitoring activities that we do. Something like Countryside Survey with its stratified random sample across the UK, where you're getting co-located measurements of a whole range of assets, can then feed into models which allow us to really get a national scale assessment of many of these things. But I would say that needs to be complemented by more detailed work at Sentinel Sites, where we can really get a process understanding, so we can understand the links between the drivers, the assets and the benefits and the actual mechanisms behind that. But these two interplay, these two kind of aspects interplay through modelling and analysis and through validation with each other. But whereas in the past we've had this historic kind of mosaic, in the future we actually need to write this as kind of one integrated purpose. And that's what we're in the process of doing. We also need to do it in the context that we are a research institute, which is distinct from delivery bodies such as Natural England, for example. So I would say that our role is to produce the underpinning evidence that could produce, say, an annual State of the Environment report, but not to actually deliver that. We need to work with partners like DEFRA, Welsh Government, Scottish Government to deliver that sort of product from our kind of core national capability. So at the moment, there are 5 or 6 kind of initiatives that we're undertaking in CEH to try and distill down what this core purpose is in this agenda. So again, going back to a freshwater example, there are a number of bodies across the UK that actually collect freshwater data. We've got here examples from pond sampling sites, that's Countryside Survey, but also lake sampling sites, which is not just CEH, but also the Environment Agency, SEPA and NRW and the Broads Authority. And it's also really that second set of bodies that are also involved in monitoring water quality in rivers. So many of these assets are monitored by a variety of bodies for a variety of reasons, actually. And there is, I think, a role in pulling those data together and combining those data to give us a national scale picture of the extent and the status of that particular asset and how that quality is changing over time. And actually, we are now in our next phase, we're going to be working very closely with UK EOF in this context and similar contexts. Those of you who don't know, UK Earth Observation Framework was actually set up by John Barringer when he was Chief Scientific Advisor to government, and its purpose was really to coordinate all the different kinds of environmental monitoring across the UK. So we have this kind of strategic ambition to provide a national core of multi-scale, holistic environmental observations. But we need to do that in a world of constrained resources, and that affects us in 2 ways. One is that some of the activities we deliver, traditionally delivered in partnership, our partners can no longer commit to that resource, and also we ourselves have additional kind of constraints in our own core resources that we can commit to this activity. So we're going to have to be imaginative in using all the kind of new techniques available in terms of Earth observation, eDNA, and citizen science, which it's the development of not just of apps but also of statistical techniques to analyse that kind of messy data, to fundamentally find new ways of delivering this sort of information. Back to our freshwater example. For example, in the past, Earth observation techniques have been sufficiently sensitive so that we could pick up the lakes represented by the red triangles there on that map. But with the new Sentinel-2 satellite data coming on stream, which much finer resolution, the indications are that we're going to be able to monitor the lakes represented by the grey triangles. That's really quite a fundamental step change. And that's largely down to size of water body. Of course, Earth observation can't deliver everything, but there are kind of key metrics that it will be able to deliver, and I've given you a list there. So that's just one example of how we're exploring Earth observation data to provide that sort of information. Another initiative is that we're looking at meta-barcoding of DNA. So essentially you can basically suck up DNA from the environment, sequence it, get a snapshot of the whole community. And here's an example of when we've done precisely that, looking at fish in Lake Windermere. 65 samples, and the frequency of positives does seem to reflect, if you compare, it does seem to reflect the abundance of the fish, species abundance, as determined by other means. Then on the right-hand side, outside that principal box here, we have species which our eDNA sequencing data suggest is there, but have not actually been detected by other means. Now, are these false positives? Well, probably in the case of smelt, they're false positives, because apparently smelt is used as dead bait by pike fishermen. So that probably accounts for one false positive. But these others might well be invasive species that have yet to have been detected by normal sampling techniques. So we're currently, reviewing a whole range of our biotic national capability monitoring to determine both to develop the means to process and analyse these data, but also to determine where we can most effectively use this as an alternative monitoring strategy. Now, another initiative, I'm going to, and this is something I've been more personally involved in, working with our statisticians at CEH, but it's kind of quite hard to make statistics visually appealing in a talk, so I'm going to do this really briefly. We've actually been looking at kind of developing analytical techniques around power analysis for monitoring. So, of course, power is the probability of detecting change of a given magnitude. So before you run an experiment or before you run any sort of monitoring scheme, ideally you would want to do a power analysis. So you know that when you get a null result, what that really means, and it's not just that you should have had more replicates. But power analyses can be really computationally intensive. So we actually developed a method to estimate power using a generic equation. Essentially, we did this for one particular sort of data, species count data, but in theory this approach could be used for any sorts of data. And we defined two sets of parameters, one around all the ways in which a monitoring scheme might vary, and another around ways in which an indicator might vary in terms of abundance, variability, presence, absence, etc. And we did a vast number of simulations. We then statistically analysed the outcomes of those simulations to produce a generic equation, and I won't go into the details of, but there were inevitably certain constraints that I would put around that. But now we have an equation that allows a very fast estimate of power in a range of scenarios. You can then use that to, this is an application here looking at butterflies and the butterfly monitoring scheme. And then, so for a particular indicator species, you can estimate, for example, how many sites might be required to deliver power of a certain level. Now, I suppose the really kind of exciting thing is that we can then use this as a foundation for developing an adaptive sampling approach. In other words, we can now design monitoring schemes to actually themselves be flexible, and they can respond to changes in the signal of what we're monitoring to make monitoring more or less intensive in response to that signal very quickly. So, for example, always best with an example, back to freshwater quality. We monitor about 253 water bodies across Scotland for freshwater quality. Do we need to monitor all of them all the time? Well, if we actually track the variation in the metrics we're using, we can then use our generic equation to estimate when we could save resources by reducing monitoring, when and where it would be sensible to do that. Okay, so another initiative that we are involved in is really, we've just initiated a project to integrate all our data and models and science across CEH, and then involving our partners in that as well, to actually link assets to human health and well-being. And this involves a number of steps here, which I'm just going to give you very brief examples for some of these steps. First of all, we're going to identify data sets across the UK, so it's not just our data sets, but key data sets of partners. So we can produce an inventory of both those data sets and the metrics that are currently used in monitoring. back to an example, what is good water quality? Well, actually, how good water quality is actually assessed depends on the benefit that you are concerned about. If you're talking about drinking water, you have a certain set of criteria. If you're talking about recreational use, you have another set of criteria. And even though there are perhaps common themes in terms of pathogen count, the levels do also depend on benefit. And also the priorities, in other words, which of those criteria are most important, may also depend upon location. So that's essentially a kind of a cataloguing exercise, but also working. It's also essentially an exercise in trying to define the most appropriate set of metrics. And in fact, in the Natural Capital Committee, we did start doing this, but we realised it was kind of quite a large exercise. So we're now trying to pick that up in CEH. And as I've mentioned before, process understanding in those links between assets and benefits is really necessary to be confident that we're measuring the right thing, so there's an iterative process, but also to instigate appropriate action when the benefit declines. Again, an example here, we measure ecological status of freshwater ecosystems through essentially metrics that look at the ecological community in freshwaters. But what does that actually mean for the benefit of clean water, depending upon whether that's for drinking or for recreation? To understand those links, we actually need to link that through functions. So, for example, a very simple example is an algal bloom might be caused by nutrient enrichment, or an algal bloom could be caused by a change in the food web, perhaps by removal of or addition of zooplankton. Changes in those abundance can lead to community changes. And of course, the mitigating measures in those two circumstances would be very different. Now, we are in a very difficult position really here, because process understanding is something that in an ideal world you would have a platform of Sentinel Sites. And indeed, a lot of our resources essentially kind of comes into this category. Historically, we've put quite a lot of resource into this process understanding, and in the future we simply will not have that resource. So we've got a difficult exercise here in talking with partners, and that includes the HEI community, about which habitats and which processes should be priorities. But there is the potential there for that to provide a platform for partnership working. So those platforms could then be form the basis for future bids where the HEI community could also be involved in working at those sites. So finally, tools and models to actually combine these natural capital data sets. We have been for a few years now developing something called Ecomaps. So this is a spatially explicit statistical tool to basically do the equivalent of a predictive model for a Y variable and a whole range of X variables, taking account of the fact that you will have spatial autocorrelation issues. So, for example, a countryside survey, stratified random sample across the UK, one of the things that were measured was floral diversity. So then you can use other spatial data sets, such as the parent material map, which is something that BGS produces, which tells you about the fundamental soil type, land cover map, which tells you about the broad land use category, a whole load of metrics, Met Office data, also atmospheric nitrogen deposition data, and physical things like altitude, to see how those factors might influence floral diversity. And then you can extrapolate across the whole of the UK, so now you have that prediction for areas where you haven't actually gone out in countryside survey to actually take your sample, and it also gives you an error estimate around that. So, for example, we have been using those tools in one contract for Natural England to produce maps of soil carbon and carbon in vegetation. And there are a range of sort of natural capital type maps that can be produced using those sorts of data. And we have been using this quite a lot in the context of Wales, in that you can then use the output from the statistical output from Ecomaps to then feed into our spatially explicit process-based models. And at CEH we have a focus on 3 such process-based ecosystem service models. LCEE, which stands for the Land Utilisation and Capability Indicator. It's not a person, it's an acronym, I'm afraid. So LCEE it actually models at very fine scale, taking account of all those spatial data sets and process understanding, the potential for an area of land to deliver an ecosystem service. So you can see here some examples about the ability for carbon storage, carbon emission, flood generating and mitigating land, and so on. And then you can overlay those maps to look at areas where you're going to get trade-offs and synergies. So finally, knowledge exchange and communication. We are very committed to the open data agenda, and we're developing portals for data sets and tools for different user groups. And at the moment, we've had a drought portal and a UK rainfall portal for a while, and more recently we've launched the UK Lakes portal and an atmospheric pollution portal. So to give you an example of the Lakes portal, I mean essentially that we have from an earlier research project in collaboration with the University College London, we actually have an inventory of over 43,000 lakes across the UK and 14,000 catchments. Largely physical data, but then we have much more specific data on a kind of decreasing subset of those lakes. But in the Lakes portal, what you can do is you can actually overlay information from the land cover map or information from the Biological Records Centre, so species diversity and ecological communities data over those. So you can look at your lake in the context of a catchment and overlay that additional information in the context of that catchment. So, delivery and partnership has always been important to us, but will be increasingly important in the future, as we will be consulting with and talking to the community as we design this kind of core national capability. But we already have some very important partnership activities, particularly with Welsh Government actually, in the delivery of GMAP. So they're building on our national capability. We have a contract with Welsh Government to do environmental monitoring to answer some very specific policy questions for them in that context. In fact, there it is, GMAP, I've forgotten about that slide. And in fact, we're using Ecomaps and LCEE in that context to extrapolate beyond the data that are actually collected under GMAP to deliver those maps of natural capital and look at those trade-offs and synergies. And actually, there are probably people in the room who know much more about GMAP than me, so I shall stop there. But we also have partnerships in other contexts, and actually recently we have launched something called, it's the Land Cover Map Plus Crops. And this actually came about as a collaboration with a business, RSAC, and essentially it's allowed us to deliver a product that's available actually under commercial license because of this, the nature of this particular partnership, but it will tell you which crop was grown in each field across the UK. So that's kind of a fantastic step forward, and of course you can immediately see all the science questions that will enable you to address by knowing that kind of detailed information. But of course, this is very much the first step. The monitoring I've been talking about is really down to, what is the status of our natural capital? How is it changing? Understanding those links to benefits. And although I think the natural capital agenda is a very exciting one and it's a very integrating one, it also leaves you with issues about how to prioritise. If you detect that benefits are at risk, how do you actually prioritise? You could do this by proximity to targets or thresholds. That's meant to be and/or direction of travel, sorry. Or you could do it by value of benefits foregone. So I just want to sort of briefly touch on some work we did in the Natural Capitals Committee to try and think strategically about how you should prioritise action to restore natural capital. So one thing that was done, which was published in our State of Natural Capital report in 2014, was like a really quick and dirty, and this really is quick and dirty, kind of risk register. And this is where we use the lens of the broad habitats rather than going back to the assets themselves. So basically, there are three things about a broad habitat that will affect its potential to deliver benefits. There's the quantity, obviously, of that broad habitat, but there's also its quality, and in some cases, its spatial configuration may also be important. So, for example, if you're thinking about woodland delivering the benefit of recreation, if it's close to a city, it's going to deliver that to a far greater extent than if it's in an inaccessible place. So this quick and dirty assessment tells us where the benefits, the delivery of benefits, are at risk because of declines in quantity, quality, or changes in spatial configuration of those broad habitats. And you can immediately see there are some broad messages there. Wildlife is in trouble, particularly in semi-natural grassland and enclosed farmland and in freshwaters. We knew that. And also woodlands, for example. We have actually increased the area of woodlands, and this has enhanced the delivery of certain benefits. But I would emphasise that this is very much a first cut, and I would hope that the kind of evidence base that we want to produce as a community in the future would be able to do a much better take on this sort of exercise. And then if you take those cells in that last table that are below target, you can then do a very simple estimate of the economic benefits of restoration. So let's take, for example, air quality here. If you actually restored air quality to appropriate levels, to target levels, you actually, thinking this is a log axis, you would actually save, this is the statistic I mentioned earlier, between 9 and 20 billion pounds per annum. But again, this is a vast simplification. It's not considering the costs of those remediating actions, and it's not considering any interactions between the interventions. So interventions to improve wildlife, for example, may well have co-benefits elsewhere. But I think although using different language, natural capital thinking or natural resource management thinking actually is, I think, deeply embedded in Welsh Government. And in 15-16, actually, it's just come to an end. The Valuing Nature programme launched the first of its placement schemes, and we hope to repeat this in the future, where we advertised for researchers to either hop disciplines or to hop from academia into policy or business to study an issue around valuing nature. And in fact, one of those placements, we actually had, we were had a large number of applications, oversubscribed 4 or 5 times. But one of those successful placements was from CEH into Welsh Government in this valuing nature agenda. And I know Lawrence Jones, who took part in that placement scheme, actually found it was a fantastic experience. And we hope to to repeat this exercise, perhaps extending it from a 3-month to a 6-month placement next time. So do please keep your eye on the Valuing Nature website for that as well. But I would say, this is just one very small example, I think we do need to think of innovative ways to kind of increase the permeability between research and policy, because both sides could benefit in terms of how, in terms of co-design of research, and also in terms of disseminating progress. So I think the Natural Capital Agenda represents great opportunities because of the integrating nature of this agenda, but also great challenges, particularly in a time of financial austerity. But I think we have a real opportunity to advance the health and well-being agenda on the basis of restoring natural capital. I'd just like to end by acknowledging all the people who have contributed to help write this presentation. Thank you very much.